Welcome back to The Real Story with Jeanne Ives. It's Sunday night, and we are going to be talking with Li Arellano. He's a U.S. Army veteran, former mayor of Dixon, was sworn in recently as an Illinois state senator for the 37th district. His district spans all over parts of Bureau, DeKalb, Henry, LaSalle, Lee, Marshall, Ogle, Peoria, Rock Island, Stark, Whiteside, and Woodford counties. He represents a vast amount of territory in the state of Illinois. I've known Lee since 2012 when we both ran for state rep. Since then, he has tackled, raising a family. I think he's got his fifth child now, but he just recently got elected to the state Senate. And that's why we're having him on, because there is a lot going on in Springfield. And Lee, it is your first term down there. What has surprised you? First of all, thanks for coming on my show. But
yeah, great to be here.
I mean, what surprised you down there that you weren't maybe expecting?
There are some things. As a local mayor for 8 years, certainly you're paying attention to the state. So some of the things I expected, there's a lot more political theater, which I expected, but it's still fascinating to see it up close. I think one thing that surprised me is how dramatically different committee work is than the floor. I think, when you're on the outside, you kind of have a rough idea of how it's working. When you're on the inside, you learn that even in the super minority, a freshman Republican who does his research and asks sharp questions can impact bills, can impact legislation. But as you well know, since you served down there, in a supermajority, once it hits the floor, it is over. You can give your speech, you can engage in the political theater, which is sometimes necessary. But any chance that substance has passed, they're never going to let one of their votes go down if they can help it. They often won't even call it to the floor, as we saw with the Homeschool Act. If they don't think they have the right votes, they don't want to look bad. So I've really, as a freshman, tried to dig into the committee work, which was the last few months. And it was surprising how effective that could be. But on the flip side, disappointing on some of those bills that are just bad or mediocre and could have been good, and you just don't have a voice. That still happens.
Well, what I find shocking every time I look in at committee, and by the way, I watched the Higher Education House Committee just a couple days ago, and they had the University of Illinois systems in, they had Northern Illinois systems in, they had a representative from a private college in. It was a 4.5-hour committee hearing. We're talking about billions of dollars that they're going to spend coming up here in the budget time frame.
Right.
And you just don't get to have the quality of questions. The other problem, though, that I find very problematic down there is they don't listen to experts.
Yeah.
And you, of all people, are an expert. I mean, you sat down there as the Dixon mayor cleaning up the Crudwell ethics problem, her stealing $56 million or $53 million, whatever it was, a ginormous amount of money from taxpayers. You were a small town mayor, but a significant town, by the way, the home of Ronald Reagan, Dixon, Illinois.
Yeah.
And you sit on the local government committee. You sit on the pension committee, which impacts local government as well. Did you feel like your expertise was listened to at all?
I think they turn it on and off depending on the pressures of the particular bill. I think there are a few bills that had to do with modernizing local governments, digital records, things that their donors didn't care about and their power base didn't care about, where they listened. There's other things where they don't listen at all. And, take the recent discussion in the Senate over our law enforcement officers being able to use the smell of cannabis or marijuana as part of their due process or as part of their investigation during a stop. And you had prosecutors with experience in exactly dealing with impaired drivers and the kind of damage they can cause in a family and in lives, speaking to the problems in the bill, and it made no difference. Folks that had not been involved in the justice system, have not been involved in dealing with those cases, completely ignored their testimony. That part is very frustrating. And so, I think the dichotomy is when it comes to a bill where they decide they're on a mission, whether it's the Safety Act or this cannabis bill, or until the homeschoolers really put their foot down, the Homeschool Act would have fallen in that category if the people hadn't risen up. They just don't listen. So yes, when we're poking around the edges, I think they've allowed me to be a little bit of a voice. When they're dealing with the big issues, they don't care about Republican input. They don't care about rural input. It's gotten to the point where I'm not sure they even care about suburban input. And as you mentioned, they don't care about expert opinion if it doesn't fit their narrative. So it just depends on the topic. And the more important the topic, I think the less they listen to expertise.
Well, in that vein as well, when you look at the committee votes that are going out of there, it appears to me, at least the votes that I have followed, that it really doesn't matter if it is a downstate Democrat senator or a Chicago Democrat senator. They vote lockstep. They vote the same.
That part is frustrating to me. So, some of these rural Democrats who are facing some of the same issues that my district is facing, they're voting against their own region, whether they vote for the gerrymandered map, which empowers Chicago over their rural or suburban regions, whether they're voting on transportation spreads, whether, we got big bailouts getting asked from Chicago, whether it's for transportation, for education. And we haven't even begun the discussion of, well, what about rural impacts in these bills? Do we have a voice? Are we getting any of these monies? Is there monies to hand out, which really should be one of the questions, of course. And I think they don't want to lose what little power they have. And so instead of speaking up for their communities, there's times where they just vote in lockstep, as you mentioned. And that is the way to keep, in gerrymandered maps anyway, that is the way to keep donations coming and power coming. If we had fair maps, the voters would punish them for voting that way. But, with these unethical maps, they can get away with that. And so they're catering more to a hard left primary or to liberal donors than they are to really what should be their region, because they pick and choose what their region is.
Yes, I mean, you do have certain Senate districts that go all the way from essentially the south suburbs of Cook County all the way down to Kankakee into very, very rural districts. Yeah. And they've actually drawn these to their advantage. And until voters wake up, we're not going to get change there. How about you are also on the pension committee? And of course, local pensions are an issue. There were a number of bills, at least in the House, that would move Tier 2 pensions essentially back to Tier 1, which would enormously increase the unfunded liability in this state. On the Senate side, in the pension committee, it seems to me like some of that has just fallen to the wayside as something they don't want to tackle yet this year. What is happening in the Senate on those pensions?
I think that's an accurate assessment. The costs involved were so massive that even the liberal side of the Democratic Party, and you can argue whether the moderate side exists under these maps, but even the liberal side looked at those costs and just said, it's not financially doable. And when you have that happen, you know how unreasonable the ask was in the first place, right? And so most of the Tier 2 fixes, even to some degree, the safe harbor discussion has kind of fallen by the wayside. I think some of the safe harbor fixes, unfortunately, only will give money to the most well-paid public employees. But that was presented in the governor's budget address. So I do still expect to see some of those. I think he budgeted around $70 million. I expect to see in whatever they slice and dice in those leadership smoke-filled rooms, I expect to see some fixes there. But again, when what they're going to do is they're going to present your teacher making $40,000 or $50,000 a year and paying for their own school supplies as the poster child. Safe harbor, that's not who's getting that money. No, it is somebody at a state university making hundreds of thousands of dollars that has run into a cap, right? And so even if you were going to look at any fixes to Tier 2 at all, which we can't afford right now, that's just the blunt mathematical truth. We haven't made an actuarial accurate pension payment in who knows how long. Certainly missed, I think, by about $5 billion last year. We're going to miss by about $5.1 billion. What an actuary will recommend this coming year. The Tier 2 money isn't there. But if there was something you were going to poke at the edges of, whether it's the age or trying to help out the lowest earners and make sure it changes for them, that's not what Safe Harbor does. That's not the discussion that's on the lead right now. So in as much as I'm sympathetic to some of the age things, and if we didn't have $8 billion in pension debt payments this year, maybe I'd be open to those conversations, right? The math isn't there. And the only part that might have a chance of getting through this year isn't even the lowest of state employee earners, or, the teacher making $50,000 and paying for her own school supplies. That's not who's going to get helped.
Yeah, no, they always use the wrong poster child for what the problem actually is. You mentioned $8 billion in a pension payment. I mean, last year's pension payment was about $11 billion, and they shorted it by 5.
Yeah, so we're going to have over an $11 billion total payment. That $8 billion, that is just the debt payment.
Oh,
If we didn't have all of that debt built up, you're right. Your numbers are about perfect. We would have about a $3 billion pension payment instead of over $11 billion. That $8 billion, that is just the pension holidays. That's the Blagojevich wasted fund years. That is just debt payments. And so when people ask about more money for education or mental health or especially property tax relief, all of that money was spent, by Blagojevich in the early 2000s, by Rauner on non-citizens. All of that money has been spent over the years, and we have these massive debt payments. And one of the stories I like to tell when I'm out giving speeches about my work on the pensions committee is Wisconsin, which is no blazing red state. It's a pretty purple state right now. They had a very good governor in Scott Walker who was addressing some issues for a while. So certainly we'd love to have that happen to us. But they're a pretty purple state. If we were funded at their levels, that $8 billion in debt would be closer to about $1.5 billion. In other words, we'd have almost $7 billion more just in this fiscal year if we were run as well as a purple state to our north. And so it's impossible to understand Illinois without understanding the depth of that financial mismanagement that went into pensions and lucrative benefits and, stacking pay at the end of careers and, quite frankly, just not making payments because they wanted to spend a whole bunch of money and refused to find it the right way or make cuts to get it.
Former Dixon Mayor Li Arellano with me, now state senator. And he's just telling us exactly what we can expect coming up in May. It's going to be budget discussions. Before we get to that, because I do want to hear from you on the budget, obviously you've probably been cut out of it. They don't let Republicans in on those meetings. But I mean, listen, Lee, we have a ton of financial issues in the state, but we have some huge cultural issues at this point.
Yes.
I mean, you've got JB Pritzker out there saying that he's going to punish El Salvador like he can for simply not releasing Garcia, who is a known MS-13 gang member. Like, why is he harping on this? You've got the Deerfield incident where they were forcing a middle school girl to change in front of a boy in her locker room. That story went not just national, but international, with even J.K. Rowling weighing in on it. You've now got the IHSA, who is essentially saying we are going to ignore Trump's executive orders on women, only women playing in women's sports. And they're thumbing their nose at him and saying, no, state law requires us to allow trans, quote, trans, air quotes, trans, biological men to play in women's sports. These cultural issues are also, let's face it, a huge problem for Illinoisans.
They are. And on many of them, despite the hundreds of millions Pritzker's money spends on messaging and all this, the public's really on our side on these issues. I have 3 daughters. They deserve their own space for competition and opportunities and leadership and teamwork. And a lot of work has been done over the years to make sure young girls like my 3 daughters have opportunities. And you're seeing records getting taken and spots being taken and opportunities be taken by biological males. And a majority of the public does not agree with that, right? And in some polls I've seen, a majority of Democrats sometimes disagree with that. So it's an issue that we do need to lead on. We are on the right side of the public. We are on the right side of ethics, and we're on the right side of defending the opportunities for these young girls and these women. So it's something that, the whole Senate caucus penned a letter. I believe all the House Republicans did. We're trying to get this sorted out. I saw our Congresswoman also, message the Attorney General and sent in a letter because unfortunately in Illinois, we all know our governor has his finger in the air as to what will play in a national Democratic presidential primary.
Well, that was the key there, Lee. A national Democratic primary. He'll go nowhere in the general election with his radical views, in my opinion.
Yeah.
He is barking up a tree to get the Democrat nomination. He is not playing to the middle road like even Newsom is attempting to do.
Right.
So what's with that? That makes no sense. He's got money to burn, obviously. Does he just want to wear the sash as the Democrat nominee for president in 2028?
I think when you've been a billionaire whole life, and especially when you were born with the silver spoon in your mouth, you begin to think you're a little invincible, right? And so I think he actually thinks he has a shot. I think he's in for a rude awakening at the national level, right? And we saw that during the VP sweepstakes for Kamala, right? They looked at him as like, this is not a good fit for our party. And while I didn't think their ultimate VP pick was a great pick either, they knew JB wasn't going to fit that niche for them of what they're looking for and what they're wanting. And in his world and with his advisors, I'm sure he believes that makes sense. Unfortunately, for those of us in Illinois, our leader isn't taking a look at the state, isn't taking a look at the diversity of ideology and thought in the state, and trying to craft legislation and a plan around that. He is building it around what sells nationally. This is why we have some of the most liberal gun laws in the nation. It's why we have some of the most liberal pro-abortion laws, including using abortion as economic development and advertising it, right? This is why some of those laws are getting struck down in the courts. My wife worked at a pro-life women's clinic, helped advocate for women. And there was a period of time where her medical license was under threat because Illinois passed a law that has now been struck down as unconstitutional, saying they had to refer to abortion and give advice on abortion and all these things that my wife just ethically would not do. Why were those laws there? Did they make sense in Illinois? No, but they made sense because our governor wants to be president, and he's trying to position himself as the most liberal person in America, the anti-Trump. He thinks that's his lane to win, and he's taken Illinois on a ride that direction. It's part of why we spent billions in non-citizen spending when we had so many other needs.
Yes.
I have to make a point right here because Dixon, we have the Mabley Developmental Institution here in Dixon. It's under investigation at the federal level because the feds do not believe, and this has been ongoing for years, that the state is taking care of people with disabilities properly. On top of that, JB is trying to cut the amount of service hours for disabled persons in community homes. Meanwhile, he was spending hundreds of millions into the billions on working age adults that aren't even citizens of our nation. So you're cutting services to the most vulnerable Illinoisans and sending money to people of working age many times who are not citizens. Why? Why would any governor of Illinois ever do that? And the answer very much lies in not all of this is geared towards an Illinois audience. It's geared towards a national primary, and we're suffering because of it.
Well, that brings me to the budget, and we only have a few minutes left with you. But you are on the Human and Health Services committees, which are
Yes.
really important when it comes to the budget. In fact, they have at least the second highest allotment in the general revenues after education.
Yes.
And they're about equal. So tell me, is there going to be some reining in of the money going to illegals on Medicaid in Illinois?
He's proposed some of that in his budget. I think he had to now that the COVID borrowed money ran out, right?
Yep.
And so we in the Republican caucus have very much tried to push that narrative and make it hard for him to undo those initiatives. The initiative being cutting the spending for the working age adults. We obviously needs to go farther than that. If I have to pick between disabled Illinoisans in our communities and non-citizens of any age, I'm going to pick Illinoisans. That's who we have a duty to. So I think we're going to see some of it because he has no financial choice. I think he's going to keep hundreds of millions of it still that should be going into our current 2025 problems of Illinois.
Lee, we only have about a minute left here. Just very quickly,
Yeah.
we're working on a Doge project ourselves with Illinois.
Yeah.
And I feel like when you look at the budget, you really don't get all the information you needed. Wouldn't it be great to just have every line item out in a spreadsheet so you could easily discern what you're spending money on?
Yeah.
Right now, it's basically words clouded by numbers.
Absolutely. And it is very hard. One thing that's very different at the state level is you don't get those numbers. At the local level as a mayor, we had those to work with and made reforms easier to work with. At the state level, take non-citizen spending. They had to do an Auditor General's report to find out how ridiculous the amounts of money were that they spent. Why didn't they know that in real time? Why couldn't we provide oversight? Because as you mentioned, they won't track those numbers for us. it's a problem.
Yep. Okay, he's Li Arellano, brand new state senator, Republican from Dixon, and former mayor of Dixon, Illinois. Thank you so much for joining me on The Real Story, Lee.
Glad to be here.